All right. Hey, welcome back. LSW20. This is Personal Finance for Entrepreneurs with Dr. Murdoch Alegi, which I'm so excited to have here. This is a session about optimizing personal and early stage finances. Dr. Kalegi's ER physician, an engineer. You started a lot of companies, quite a number of companies, honestly, mostly in the health technology sphere. And I'm so excited to have him here because he's very well experienced in optimizing early stage finances for your own business and how you can figure out your own personal finances in the midst of it all. So I'm going to turn it over to you and have a wonderful session.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Morgan. Thanks so much to everyone who's joining. As Morgan mentioned, I've started quite a few of my own businesses that have all done okay. And when reflecting on what has helped them be okay, I've realized it's not just how I manage those businesses, but it's actually how I manage aspects of my life. And so years ago, I started teaching some of those how you manage aspects of your own life. And I've realized one of the things I needed to teach to really be helpful was to talk about uncomfortable subjects. So we're going to talk about some uncomfortable subjects today. What are uncomfortable subjects? So there's things you don't talk about like politics and religion, and another one can be money, depending on what aspect of money you're talking about. And so we're going to talk about that uncomfortable topic of money. Before we get to that uncomfortable topic, I first like to remind everyone of something very comfortable. Now, usually when I'm able to do this in a Q&A format, I'll pose to someone in the audience, why are you here? Why are you joining this session? And they'll give an answer. Oh, well, I want to accomplish this, do that. Well, and why do you want to do that? And well, because then I'll be successful with this. And well, why is that important? And ultimately, the answer is always the same, the final answer. And that's, I want to be happy. So before we talk about finance, we're going to get into the purpose of finance and how we manage it. So actually the first half of this talk may not seem that finance related, but we're setting ourselves up to properly think about finances, both entrepreneurial finance with our ventures and personal finances. And so if we can start with this end goal in mind and work backwards, then maybe we can figure out the best way to optimize our finance. So like I said, the end goal, every time I've done this exercise 100 times, and it always ends with people want to be happy. Like everything we do in life, even if that thing doesn't directly make us happy, we're hoping it'll indirectly make us happy at some point. And so that is true of a lot of things. And so what kind of things make us happy is I always throw this out into the audience and people give me different answers, but they tend to fall with certain common themes that are in a couple categories. And I'll get to those categories, but people will say, oh, things like relationships make me happy, my friends, my family, challenging myself, accomplishing something makes me happy. Helping other people, having control over my own life. And there's a lot of other things, humor and health and nature and having experiences. But then some people honestly admit, but it's also not these like big ethereal concepts that bring happiness. Sometimes it's these little immediate things like a really good meal, like food, or watching a really good show or seeing something funny on the internet, like screens. And then people are being really honest, like, hey, if I buy something, and so if I get more of that stuff that helps me buy things, that makes me happy. Or if I get like a promotion or some accomplishment that gets me more money, that makes me happy. And I'll talk about why I separated these into two columns. It's interesting. I'm an ER doctor, and one answer that no one ever gives me when I do this exercise is drugs. Drugs make me happy. Which the reason I find that interesting is working in the ER, I see people real high all the time, and they're real happy. And so, considering how pervasive that is, how prevalent it is, it's the number one cause of accidental death, overdose. Why don't people list it off as a thing that makes them happy? The answer I always get, sustainability. it doesn't last, right? It kind of comes, gives you a little boost, then it goes away. And actually, I'm going to give you a real quick primer on the way drugs work, and I promise we will tie this back to finance. You get some sort of stimulant to the brain, some sort of neurotransmitter, and it's traveling from one neuron, one of your brain's cells, to another neuron that's receiving this. And when it's in massive amounts, your brain adjusts and says, okay, wow, this made me feel really good. That's great, but that's too much. So I need to adjust. So I need to take away some of these receptors. And so you have less of these pleasure receptors. And so to feel as good requires a higher and higher dose because your brain adjusts to this. And that's why you form a tolerance and people need a higher dose. And then if you try to stop the substance, because you have less of these pleasure receptors, you will then get some withdrawal and actually feel discomfort, feel very unhappy and miserable. Drug withdrawal, one of the worst things I see in the ER. So yeah, that's your brain on drugs. But what's interesting about that is there's actually a lot of things that have a very similar effect, just less direct. It's more indirect, but it stimulates your dopamine or serotonin or some of these pleasurable neurochemicals that make you feel good. And that tends to be the left side stuff. That's the stuff that gives you pleasure. The stuff on the right side, it's less immediate. It's not as like this immediate boost. Forming relationships and maintaining them is hard. Challenging yourself inherently is hard. Helping other people, you have to get off your butt and do stuff. It's tough. Creating control in your own life. These are all challenging things. So they don't produce this immediate pleasure. But when you accomplish them and you look back, it gives you a sense of satisfaction. So, people often wonder why are people entrepreneurs? Why do people pursue them and seem to like them? Because it's the hardest thing you can do professionally. It is so much easier to just get a job where the duties are clear. But where you are going where there is no path before you and you are blazing a trail, that is way difficult, scarier, more challenging. But I think the reason so many people do it, and in fact, when they do it, are not really able to go back to having a more traditional job, is it satisfies a lot of these needs. It's very challenging. Usually, when you're an entrepreneur, you're trying to solve a problem, usually one you care about. So you're serving society in some way. And talk about autonomy. Yeah, it's scary not having a path laid out before you, but you have such control over your own life. People don't want to give that up once they have it. And in fact, you can learn a lot of things by looking back at what people are glad they did and what they regret. People, when they pursue something entrepreneurial, tend to look back and they're glad they did it, sometimes even when they fail. And in general, when people look back, they're like, man, I'm really glad I pursued these things in my life. I really value the relationships and how I challenged myself and how I helped other people. And when they look back on this stuff, like, yeah, because that's gone. Because a big difference between pleasure and satisfaction, it's lasting, it's sustaining. But pleasure, kind of like our drug example, it's fleeting. It's not sustainable. And so when we look back, 20 years, 30 years later, when we're older, and some pleasurable thing we may have had in the past, it doesn't really stick with us. It doesn't feel as good. So, like I said, when people are older, they tend to look back on their life and think, man, I wish I even more pursued this stuff. And this stuff, I wish I didn't give as much attention to. Because if you think about the issue of drugs, like there's nothing wrong with them inherently. It's the fact that one, if they require these escalating amounts, usually at some point they will do harm. With a drug specifically, you'll stop breathing or your heart stops beating. But with this stuff, you eat too much food, you become obese. You stare in front of a screen all day, you become physically stagnant. You put so much time into buying stuff, you go deeply into credit card debt. It's when you pursue something excessively. And then the other issue is using this as a substitute for this. People who tend to be dependent on drugs, they're spending less time nurturing their relationships or challenging themselves or helping other people because they're getting their high, they're getting their pleasure from this stuff. And so you're less motivated to do this stuff. And so all this stuff can kind of do that as well. Like, why put the effort into calling a friend when I can binge watch Netflix? Why make something healthy and nutritious to me when I can just grab, some fried food off Grubhub? So it's just a matter of how you utilize the pleasures and harms they can do if they're not managed properly. So I can tell you this, I can lay this out for you and give you this physiological primer, but deep down you already know this. You can watch any Hallmark movie and get this message. Like, okay, it's about relationships and helping other people and all that stuff. But even knowing that, we still, as a society, when we look back at our lives, tend to feel we did too much of this and not enough of this. And so the question is why? Why, knowing what the right thing to do is, can we have obstacles to actually doing them, to being that person that we know we should be, but when we look back, we're like, oh, we wish we did a little more of one thing or the other. So there's three main impediments to doing that. You're kind of born in this state, this primitive state. There's three main challenges to becoming this more evolved state. This is how we grow in our lives. When you're a baby, you just want to be fed and have fun and all this stuff. It's when we grow and evolve and get older, we start to think, okay, we want more of these. So the three impediments to progressively making that change, even though we will make that change, it's just about how quickly we do it. I call the three C's because I like things that are easy to remember. So three C's. And then, so these are the three impediments to change. And the reason we're going to talk about this is because when I get to the more into the finance, it will be a difference. It will be a change than maybe how you've thought about things or perceived things before. And so to make those changes, we have to think about what's the blockage to change. And then we can overcome that and become even more actualized. So the first one is just our coding. As I mentioned, we are born in a very primitive state. In fact, civilization has worked very, very hard over tens of thousands of years to make sure we prioritize this left side stuff, because this left side stuff, for most of history, significantly improved our survival. We needed to get all the food and salt and fat and all the stuff we could get. We needed to have lots of stuff and be the alpha, or money or status, whatever could improve our ability to survive and reproduce. So this is deeply coded within us. The thing is, something funny's changed over the last 50 to 100 years. While survival still comes with challenges, especially for a lot of the world, it is a lot less hard than it used to be. And I want to be clear and emphasize, I'm not saying it's not hard, especially for a lot of people, but from a relative basis, over the last century, there has been a dramatic change in how hard it is. The lifespan has increased unbelievably in the last 100 years. So survival is no longer that hard. So we have this tens of thousands of years of coding for something that's just really changed in a very small speck of human history. And unfortunately, while we are deeply coded for survival and have this hardwired within us, it is not coding to actually make us happy. In fact, evolution has worked very, very hard to make sure you are unhappy, to make sure you are dissatisfied. Because if you're happy and content and you have need for nothing, then you stop striving. And yet you do not boost your chance of survival as much as possible. So that's part of the reason these things that we seek, that we think, okay, this is going to make us feel good, they give us this short-term hit, but then that goes away because then we still need to strive and we need to get that next hit. So, deeply wired within us. The second impediment to change, conformity. So even if we can break out of our own coding, we are a tribal species, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I mean we are social. We need to belong. We all crave a sense of belonging, and if that is lacking in some way, we'll look for it wherever we can get it. So it is very, very hard to do things that might make you feel rejected from your group or your society in some way. And this will affect a lot of things. This will affect your thoughts. This will affect what you do. Being entrepreneurial, being innovative, having a new idea, it's really hard when our internal craving is to assimilate, to be like others. I'll tell you, every company I've ever started has met with deep criticism, a lot of times from my colleagues, a lot of times from my friends. And that is hard. And all those companies have ended up being successful. But still, going through that experience, standing out in some way, that's not easy. The final manifestation, the final C of our impediment to change is by far the most powerful, and probably one of the most powerful psychological forces in society today. And that is called cognitive dissonance. So, for those who don't know, what cognitive dissonance is the difficulty the brain has having two contradictory ideas at once. That is uncomfortable for the brain. Brain likes comfort. The brain likes pleasure. Evolution has worked very hard for a long time for you to avoid discomfort and you to seek what's comfortable. And having two separate ideas and balancing them in one brain at once, oh, that's not easy. And what that manifests in is difficulty changing, difficulty evolving. Because at some point, to change and evolve, you have to take some past idea and you have to welcome some new idea. And they have to live in the brain, even if briefly, at the same time. And because that is uncomfortable, your brain works very hard to repel it. So all these things, coding, conformity, it's not like your brain thinks, oh, there's a new idea there, but I reject it because of my evolutionary wiring. You just don't even welcome a new idea. You instantly come up with you actively avoid it. We see this manifested, I don't know, in looking for like-minded ideas when we read media or about politics. We like to be in an echo chamber rather than expose ourselves to new things. So we actively avoid it, or our mind reacts so quickly to it that we couldn't have, there's no chance we could have actively processed it. Like we immediately reject it, like, oh, that's a crazy idea. Or no, that can't work because of this. And usually those arguments manifest in one of two forms. Either it can be in the form of the extreme, like, oh, well, that doesn't make sense. And that's like, Nazi Germany. Or it can manifest in the universality, like, well, that idea doesn't work in all cases, in all times, in all places in the universe. Yeah, that's true for most things. So the interesting thing about cognitive dissonance is coding and conformity, they get weaker over time as we get older. You start to realize, okay, eating a bunch of salty, fatty food, that's going to make me feel nasty later. I'm not going to do it, or it's going to make me obese or bad for my health. So we start to change. Conformity, you start to say, okay, I don't care about what everyone thinks of me. I just start to care about, the people that I have unconditional relationships with and the people I'm really committed to. And so those get weaker as we get older. Cognitive dissonance gets stronger because we have now invested more in the ideas we already have, in our identity. And so to suspend that in some way, to think differently, becomes way, way harder. So why have I talked about all these? You're probably going to experience some of this today. Again, I'm going to talk about some new ideas, and it's cognitive dissonance will manifest in like, oh, well, that can't work because of this. Or even though I'm a living example in front of you and I can cite thousands, maybe more of others, similarly who have had success using some of these principles, it's going to be uncomfortable. And so when we feel that discomfort, we'll very quickly come up with arguments against. I'll talk about some of those arguments. But I guess my encouragement of you is to think about something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is the Dunning-Kruger effect is the more certain, or the less we know about something, the more certain we are of our knowledge about it. And so as people become more and more knowledgeable about a topic, they actually get more comfortable welcoming different ideas and experiencing cognitive dissonance and things sitting in the brain at once. that's how you become more knowledgeable, because you can see all sides. And so you actually become more unsure, less confident about stuff the more knowledgeable you become. But the great thing about being less confident about a topic or ideas, or being more unsure, is there's another word for that, and it's called open-minded. And being open-minded is how you grow, how you evolve. And I'm not saying open-mindedness is welcoming any new idea you get, but it's considering it, letting it sit there, being willing to process it, see it, and evolve with it. So, so that's the basic difficulties with change. We're now going to dive into the finance stuff. One other reason I love talking about finance stuff is because the other way cognitive dissonance manifests is it makes it harder to see things that are not in your incentive to see. I can cite you plenty of examples, and I'm sure you can too, where people genuinely believe the thing that's in their interest to believe because they have an incentive to believe it. Because cognitive dissonance, it's very hard to, this thing, it would bring me money and other stuff, accolades or what have you. But this thing is like bad for society. It's very hard to welcome those two ideas. And so generally people believe that the thing that is in their personal incentive is good for society and just the right thing to do. My point is, if you can manage those incentives, if you can manage your, with the primary being financial, if you can manage those incentives, you can actually see things for as they are, rather than through a filter of, greed or narcissism or insecurity or fear. And so my goal in helping you optimize your finances is, yes, it can help you live a better personal financial life. Yes, it can help you be more successful with your ventures, and we'll talk about all that. But also, you can actually see things for as they are, and that will help you in more ways than I can possibly count. All right, now to get to the good stuff, get to the finances. So, as I mentioned, I like to talk about personal finance with entrepreneurs because I believe personal finance and entrepreneurial finance are really well integrated. And here's what I mean. Now, this audience might be at different stages of their entrepreneurial journey, or even not on that journey. So what I say might be considered basic for the ones who are more advanced, but I want to make sure everyone's up to speed. The way entrepreneurial finance typically works, where you're raising money, an investor is giving you money in exchange for your business, is from at the earliest possible stages of your idea or product or service, it's the highest risk. And because it's the highest risk, because you don't have a minimum viable product or you don't have revenue or what have you, an investor who's trying to get a good return on their money has to factor that risk. And so they need a higher return to account for that risk. And to get that possible higher return, they can command a lower valuation for your company. Your company is worth the least at the beginning. And what you try and do is you raise some money at that early stage to get used to some new milestone to de-risk, so that there's less risk, not as higher returns demanded, so your valuation is better and it goes better, and then you raise more money on that higher valuation, etc. And you keep trying to get to a higher valuation until you have some sort of exit. That higher valuation is advantageous because then you give away less of your company when you command a higher valuation to raise a certain amount of money. For example, if you are trying to raise $500,000 and the valuation you are commanding is $1 million, you have to give away 50% of your company. And we won't worry about pre-money and post-money and all that stuff. So let's just keep numbers simple, 50%. Versus if it's 10 million, you only have to give away 5%. So where I think that's significant is, let us remember some of the joys of being an entrepreneur, as hard as it is. The autonomy. So when you're raising money at a very early stage, you have to give away more of your company, more shares, more equity. And so you have to give away more control. The more you have to give away, the more control you lose, the less joy there is. The more you have to be responsive to your investors and shareholders. And you have to be responsive regardless. But if they have a whole much bigger say in your company, especially voting shares, and can dictate what you do, it starts to look a lot more like an employee again. So you're giving away autonomy. The other thing is, one thing entrepreneurs look forward to is, if I'm successful, there's an upside. Well, think about the more you give away, what happens? There's one of two possible outcomes. You could fail and your company not work out. Okay, that's not fun. Or you could succeed and that equity becomes really valuable. Awesome. But then you gave away a lot more of it. So you gave away a lot more of that valuable equity. You lost more of that valuable equity. So I am a big believer in the very early stages, decreasing how much you give away. Now, later on, when you command a much higher valuation, and it's a lot less the company you're giving away to raise a certain amount of money, okay, then no big deal. If you're giving away just a few percent, whatever. But if you're having to give away like a majority or whatever, that has significant implications on your autonomy and the outcome. So I'm a big believer in bootstrapping. But yeah, that sounds nice. Great. Bootstrap, put some of my own funds, whatever. You have to have the funds to do that. And that's not easy. But this is why I care about personal finance tied in with entrepreneurial finance. Because when I say put in the funds, it's not typically, you have to buy all this stuff and equipment and real estate and all this stuff. You just have to have the personal time. That's what you're really buying, the time to work on this. So let's talk about how you manage your time financially. So a startup has a runway. And for those that don't know what a runway is, it's basically the amount of money in the bank divided by what's called the burn, which is how much you're spending over a certain period of time. So if you have 50 grand in the bank and your burn is 10 grand a month, you have a 5-month runway for your company. Because in 5 months, you're out of runway. What happens to a plane out of runway? They crash. So you run out of runway, and you never want to run out of runway while you crash. See, you never want to run out of runway while you are with your company, because you can't come back from that. You're out of runway. You're done. You're toast. The thing is, we as individuals have a runway too. That's not unique to companies. If you have 50 grand in the bank and you're spending 10 grand a month, you have a 5-month runway. And so, as I mentioned, typically those early stages of your venture, it's not about having these millions of dollars to buy all this equipment and manufacture your product and all this. It's to develop your idea. It's to talk to people and get smart about the space and about the technology and how to position yourself. It's learning. It's your time is the most valuable asset in the early stages of a company. And so when I say you want to bootstrap in those early stages, really what I'm saying is you want to fund your own time, which really that's just having a runway. You want to have a runway. So I'm going to talk about, for pretty much the rest of this time, how to build your personal runway so that you have the freedom to build your companies. Here's the secret to all my successful companies. Then there's lots of others. It's not like there's just one. I've worked with really smart people and great ideas, and some of it's luck and right place, right time. But for me, having the runway to be able to do what I needed to do with these companies, most of these companies at some point weren't able to pay me. We needed to build them up. 4 of them It was just me and the co-founder, CEO at first. And so we needed to get through those stages. So we are going to talk about personal finance and how to build your runway. So when we think about runway, there's a few different components to it, which I'll get back to. But before I get to that, I want to talk about just expenditures. Which is the big thing that affects our runway. So at some point, maybe you have a regular job that's making money. Maybe you're making money in a venture. But let's say you're making income of any kind. That income can go to two things, and only two things. One, the thing most people income go to, we're going to call liabilities. And I don't exactly mean like liabilities like on a balance sheet, but similar concept of things that cost you money. And once the income goes to liabilities, the money's gone. So that's like you buy a TV, like a newer TV, or you buy a nice car. And so most of our income goes to liabilities. Like buy the thing, the money's gone. And what's been interesting for me to observe is most people's liabilities tend to increase in some proportion to their income. In fact, they've done studies on, how much income do you need to be happy? And the answer is pretty consistent, and it's about 50% more than you're already making. So every time people get to a new income level, they think, okay, now I need to get to this higher level and then I'll be happy. And it's because their expenses grow. I mean, it starts right out of college. Like you graduate, you start making an income. Okay, now I'm going to get that nicer TV. Now I'm going to get a new car. I've worked hard. I've earned this. I'm going to switch to two-ply. Your expenditures go up, and then there's unexpected things, taxes, or your refrigerator breaks, or oh my God, I'm having a kid. So your expenses increase. And so you have more and more liabilities, and the money goes, and you need to, and maybe you save a little bit, but overall, this is how most people live their lives. Nothing wrong with it. Some people devote some of their money to what we're going to call assets. And so assets are things that make that money. Yeah, not exactly like what's on a balance sheet, but similar. Things that produce profit. So they buy a stock that has a dividend or appreciates in price. They buy a real estate where they make rental income or that appreciates in price. Something that pulls an income, or they buy parts of businesses that has an income or that's the business. So it generates money too, but instead of being gone, like with a liability, it's still there. It doesn't go away. And you can probably guess what people who buy assets do with the income that their assets generate. They buy more assets. And then that generates even more income. And they buy more. And so on. And for anyone that knows anything about compounding, this starts to grow exponentially. So let's think about this in the context of a runway. So by buying less liabilities, by having less expenditures where the money just goes away, you're decreasing your burn. You're decreasing how much goes away per month. So that increases the runway. And you're growing your savings. So how much you're starting with. So that increases your runway. But then you're also making income that's growing exponentially that can either offset your burn or add to your savings. So that improves your runway. So this might grow exponentially. This grows even. If it's exponentially, it's a really high exponent. Your runway can grow very, very quickly by managing your liabilities versus your assets. And by very, very quickly, I mean, I'm amazed at people how quickly they can create a runway that lasts them a very long time, sometimes infinite, meaning the income their assets are generating offsets all of their burn, they're good. So there's with this, some thoughts come up like, okay, that'd be great if I could buy assets. But but it's not that easy. Or I really like my liabilities. I like my new TV. I like my new car, what have you. We'll talk about that real quick. So here's when you buy a liability. Let's say this is time, and this is happiness. When you buy a liability like new TV, new car, whatever, yeah, it's gonna bring you some joy. It will. Gives you that little dopamine boost. But something funny happens. You kind of tend to attenuate to it. Like we've already talked about, you adapt like drugs. In fact, there's a term for this. It's called hedonic adaptation or hedonic treadmill, where, yeah, you get that boost, but then it goes away and you need the next thing. So you get that boost and it goes away. And sometimes, if you're like always trying to seek that boost and you then lack it, well, it can actually turn negative. And that's sort of withdrawal. Sometimes. So that's when you buy a liability. But when you buy an asset, what are you really buying? You're buying your autonomy. You're buying freedom. That won't give you, that right-sided thing, that won't give you the quick boost. In fact, you won't feel much at first. But over time, as it grows and you have more control over your life and you get that exponential growth in your runway. Now, if I'm being honest, there will be a point this level's off. And that's because you have that infinite runway. And at some point, money makes no difference in your life. And that's a nice place to be. So those are your options. Now, a lot of people think either they don't have the flexibility in their liabilities to buy more assets, which, again, people, their liabilities tend to grow in proportion to their assets, and they think, okay, I just need a little more and I'll get to here. I know plenty of people that make $1 million a year, and it's almost entirely consumed by liabilities. They spend it basically, and you might think, well, they're idiots. No, it would happen to you too. It's your natural coding and evolutionary tendency. It's going to happen. The kids need private schools, and you'll convince yourself it's kind of this right side stuff. Like, oh, and I need to give my kids the best stuff, and I need to maintain this wear the fancy suits so people give me work where I can make more money, even though that doesn't really seem to matter much anymore. That superficial stuff. But you convince yourself. Cognitive dissonance. It controls your thoughts. So they think they don't have the flexibility and liabilities, but most of us do. So my wife and I, for now it's like a game. You have to actively try to reduce your liabilities because your natural tendency is going to be to grow them. So, I still drive my first car, 96 Civic. That hasn't changed when I became a doctor, when I started all my companies, published books, whatever. That's never changed. But I can cite 100 other things. My wife's a professor too. And we've just chosen this sort of minimalist or least essentialist lifestyle. Now, the way cognitive dissonance manifests is other ways, and that's sort of immediate rejection. This can't work, even though lots of people do this. A lot of people think, well, they'll take it to an extreme. I mentioned the extremes, a common counter argument. And they'll say, okay, well, what do you and your wife still enjoy some things, right? Well, absolutely. Or like, well, you say, should I go live in a sleeping bag in the woods? How far do you take this? Pick this visually. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Most people are familiar with this. I'm going to simplify it. The bottom layer is your most basic needs: shelter, food. There's emotional ones there too, like love. Um, so basic needs to survive. And at the top, there's this thing called self-actualization. Being the best version of yourself. It can mean different things to different people, but it's usually, some sort of completeness or transcendence. We'll spend a couple minutes talking about that. In the middle is the discretionary stuff. We call it a lifestyle, lack of a better term. So the basic principle of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is you cannot get to a certain layer without having another layer satisfied. Once that layer is satisfied, you cannot worry about your lifestyle until you have food and shelter. In other words, you cannot get to self-actualization without having your lifestyle be all set. But here's what's great about this. Yeah, you have to go through this layer, the lifestyle layer, but you get to control how thick it is. That is completely up to you. And so I am not saying you can make it 0, but you can make it a lot thinner. See, a lot of people are under the misperception that up here, self-actualization is just a lot of this. Well, now I have a really high status and I make a ton of money and I have a huge house and I have all these things. And now that's the thing they're striving for with self-actualization. Now, you're just making that layer bigger. It's just a bigger barrier. Remember, self-actualization is going beyond this, transcending it. And so that means this no longer influences your life. And when you get there, if you can get there to self-actualization, going beyond this is where you'll really start to kill it as an entrepreneur. See, the way the brain works, and I'm a physician, clinician, you have this worry center, the amygdala in the midbrain. So to use your frontal cortex, where all the creativity and elaborate cognitive processes is happening and really thinking and coming up with new ideas, you have to get past it, the amygdala. It's kind of like this. Implications of that, you cannot think creatively and find your calling while you are desperately worried about the mortgage in your kids. The mind just doesn't work that way. And maybe you could try, and sometimes we hear these heroic stories of I had nothing and I needed to resolve the situation, so I came up with this idea and I hustled and I pushed and I succeeded. Yeah, those stories exist, but I see way more successful entrepreneurs that don't need to succeed, that already are in a good place because they can think creatively and they can be innovative and they have freedom. And freedom is a lot more powerful than desperation. So I am a big believer. I know for me and many people I know who started successful companies, in doing as much as you can to expand your runway, because that has a lot of positive implications as an entrepreneur. I already talked about the financial ones and when you can bootstrap your time, but there's other things. In fact, even if you're not an entrepreneur, in all aspects of your life, number one, if you do not like what you are currently doing to make income and you have a large runway, you will stop doing it. It is just not possible to motivate yourself to get out of bed and do some job that you are not a big fan of or does not provide you meaning or joy if you already have a big runway. Just because it provides you nothing and instead takes away your time. But if you do enjoy what you're doing and you have a large runway, you like it a whole lot more because you don't have to do it. You're choosing to do it every day, and you know you're choosing to do it. You know you are exercising your autonomy, and you are still doing this despite it not being necessary for you to do. And what happens then is because you no longer have that external incentive, I am doing this thing for money, which those external incentives, they tend to have they do work. You pay people more per widget, they push more widgets, but they have a couple downsides. One, if it's not like that per widget situation, it's just gonna make a salary or whatever, people will tend to do the minimum possible to make that. That's actually their incentive, to do the minimum possible to make a fixed amount of money. But also, it's been demonstrated, there's a lot of studies showing now, when you pay people more to do creative tasks, they actually perform worse. People, when they have external incentives, promotion stuff, money, to think innovatively, they actually are less able to do so. And why? Because they're so driven and they have the stress, and the mind tends to focus on doing the task in front of them rather than broaden and pull together all the things that are required to do something creative and innovative. So another sort of cognitive dissonance, quick argument I get sometimes against is, we're not really against, but more questioning, like, but I really love something. You say, do I have to give up that thing I love? And I'm saying no. I'm saying only put your resources to the thing you love. I'm saying focus your resources more on the thing you love rather than anything you don't love. I love starting companies. I love working on innovative ideas. That gets my resources. Now that I'm better off, I also care about other things like foster kids and stuff. So that gets a lot of my resources now. That's what I care about. I had this one student. He said, "I love motocross. I don't want to, and it's an expensive hobby. I don't want to give it up." I'm saying, great. Definitely put your resources in the motocross that you love, rather than let the advertisers that are spending millions, billions of dollars take away on your resources for things you care less about, but they try to convince you that you want just as much. Focus on what you love, because that's another advantage of this. When you have that free runway and you're consuming less of those simple pleasures, buying this thing and feeling my dopamine hit, getting this thing and feeling, and you become less attached to those external incentives, it actually becomes easier to find that thing you love, even if you don't know what you love is. Because you can try different things and see what brings you joy. And it's easier to discern that joy when you don't have all these easy sources of pleasure, because you can then start to differentiate the signal from the noise. So with the motocross example I gave you, he realized, and sort of this framework of looking back in your life, he wants to serve humanity in some way. He wants to do something entrepreneurial, but he loves motocross. How could he bring those together? He's like, I'm going to start now, when I'm young, in my early 20s, learning everything I can about the motocross business and real estate. And I'm going to build or buy a motocross track, and I'm going to have it as a place that at-risk youth can come and feel a place of safety and find an activity they find engaging and enjoyable. And so this guy gets the world. He gets to put all his resources now to put something he cares about more than anything, and he gets to feel the joy now, starting in his early 20s, of pursuing something that he really loves, really cares about, without being governed by fear. We should all be so lucky to discover that early. But my point is, if you can decrease these external incentives, these quick boosts, and you can expand your runway, and you can create freedom in your life, you can find those things that give you joy. And so what happens is, rather than put that minimum possible that you might for certain types of income generating activities, you're just going to throw yourself in, and you're going to do whatever you can to succeed. And that's the big secret, giving yourself that freedom to find what excites you, that you start putting in those hours, not out of desperation and fear, which can narrow your viewpoint, but because you're so excited and you're so passionate for it. Because then you are most likely to succeed as an entrepreneur. But even if you fail, that's okay, because you are doing something you deeply care for, and you found that thing you deeply care for. It was only through having such freedom that I was able to find things I care about and work on problems that I want to solve, and not because, oh, this pay me this or this pay me that. And most people I know, most of my colleagues, especially physician colleagues, they don't have that freedom. I have had plenty of people I have a friend, he makes about 700 grand a year. He was hesitant to take a job he was really excited about because it would cut his pay to 650. So I'm saying give yourself that freedom to find the thing you really care about and to throw yourself into that joy. And you have that runway to bootstrap yourself and maybe some early expenses. So that is my talk about integrating personal finance and entrepreneurial finance. If you ever want to get in touch with me to talk about any of this, my email is mailmurdoc, mailmurdoc@gmail.com. I appreciate you watching, listening, opening your minds and thoughts to at least process, to figure out what might make sense for you on your entrepreneurial journey. And I wish you luck with that journey. I'm not sure if we have time for questions, so I'll defer to Morgan.
We do. If anybody has some, drop them into the comments. That was awesome. Thank you so much. I love talks like this that integrate some of the biological and evolutionary components that we may overlook in the course of time. One of the things that I did have a question that had popped up during the talk. One of the things that we had a question on a session the other day that resurfaced, and I thought it would be interesting to get your perspective on, especially as you were talking about preserving percentages of your startup early on, right? Until you get to a higher valuation. The question was basically, how do you tell the difference between a venture and a vulture accelerator group, or a venture and a vulture investor? Do you have any insight or tips on that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I know.
And some of that might be instinctual. So with my companies, I will say we have always cared deeply about the people we bring on as investors or accelerator things we partner with. We care deeply about the ethics and make sure their ethics and values are aligned with ours. You can usually discern that pretty quickly. Some of that might be instinctual, or you can just tell in conversation, or maybe they have a certain reputation. I would say, for us, money, when we were raising money, we tried to be in a situation where we're never so desperate that we would take any money we could get. And instead, we'd want to get the smartest money possible. And so by smart money, as your viewers might already recognize, is people that bring in a strategic value beyond just the money. So we would actually try to use raising funds as a tool to bring other value to our company, where the person we were bringing in that was a value was aligned because they were invested with us. And so generally, when you bring in that kind of smart money, they're smart enough to not want to be a vulture. And I manage the life science, or I help co-lead the life science group with Rocky's Venture Club, a larger angel group. And one thing that we emphasize at an early point is we do not want to command too low a valuation of the company or too high. We do not want to try and take too big a bite or be sharks, because that really hurts the company down the line. And by hurting the company down the line, we're hurting ourselves as investors. And so instead, we're trying to work with the entrepreneur to figure out the right valuation, the valuation that actually makes sense for what they're at that stage, rather than get the best we could. And the great part about doing that is then the entrepreneur and investor are pretty aligned, and there's just some usually small negotiation in terms of like 10%, 20% this, rather than just trying to grab your big bite. And it works really well. Rockies tends to do really well with supporting and coming up with the right agreements with entrepreneurs.
That's awesome. Well, and good news, Dave Harris is on right after with Rocky's Venture Club. So if you want to hear more, stick around.
Just to give a plug, Dave is fantastic. I'm sure anything he talks about will be of significant value to the viewers.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. I think we're actually at time, and we'll see everybody in a few minutes for our next session. So thank you again for joining.
Thank you, Morgan. Thanks, everyone.